Welcome to another tips and techniques video. This is an episode about gluing the edge of your plastic fenders up inside the fiberglass quarter panels so that you can mount your wheel liners back in the Smyth Performance Kit rear quarter panels. I had a question from one of the guys. He requested a video on this, and then I realized I've never put this in any of the videos that I've done. So I figured I'll go ahead and do a video here on this is my techniques. This is how I do it. There's I'm sure 1,000 other ways to do it, but I'll try to point out the considerations of why I do it the way I do it, and you can make your own call. This is about getting the wheel liner mounted. So you need these tabs off of the fender from the fenders that you take off, right? This is the factory fender. Wheel liners are a debatable item. So I've run plenty of cars without the wheel liners actually in, but on the Ute, specifically the Beetle Ute, and to some degree true of the Jettas and the Audis, and I can't speak to the other kits, the wheel liner is necessary. So one of the problems with wheel liners is they tend to collect stuff on the inside and hold it against metal or other surfaces that causes corrosion. Let me show you an example here. So here's a Jetta, and it's a Mark V Ute. But see this corrosion here, this rust out. I mean, that fender is shot. Time for a new fender. And that's really, well, it's not the fault of the wheel liner. It's the fault of the previous owner that didn't ever clean it out. What happens more often in the front than in the back is that the leaves that collect in from the top get washed down inside the fender and collect here in the bottom and hold moisture against this metal fender. And it can't escape because that wheel liner is there. And this is exactly what happens. You just get rust out and you can see all this crap. And there's been plenty of cars that I've taken that wheel liner out and found this packed full of leaves. It'll be packed full of leaves halfway up, and that just holds moisture in there. So it's not as bad on the Beetles because a lot of it is plastic, a lot of the bodywork. But that's one of the arguments as to why to not run wheel liners. Another is fitment issues. If you're trying to fit a bigger than spec, wider or taller than spec wheel tire combo, you can run into issues with making contact. So a lot of guys that are running aftermarket wheel setups will just take their wheel liners out. And really it's rarely an issue. But on the Beetle, so I'm spinning around here to look up in the Beetle, here's why I feel it's important to put your wheel liners in. So on the left, the little bit more brown color, hopefully there's enough light in here, that's fiberglass, and this is original steel here. Well, if you are not running wheel liners, when you drive in the rain, you're gonna sling water off the tires and it'll go through those cracks, and then you'll get moisture settling down in here. So if you run your wheel liners, that will prevent that. It'll keep the water from slinging up into that crack because you have the wheel liner that blocks it. So makes good sense. So that is a long way of saying, even though in a lot of cars I recommend not running wheel liners, in the Beetle Ute, especially in the back, you need to run wheel liners. So if you've accepted that you need to run wheel liners in your Beetle Ute, if I've convinced you or you were already convinced, then what you need to do to get the liner to sit in there correctly is cut that outer lip off of your fender, the plastic factory fender, and glue it up inside here so that you have these tabs to attach the wheel liner to so the wheel liner doesn't flop. If it's floppy, it's going to end up contacting the tire and getting eaten up, and then you might as well not have it if it has a bunch of big holes in it, right? this big old nasty beast in here that will keep the water around the tire and not let it go into the bodywork. Okay, by the way, when you have your wheel liners out, that's a great time to hit them with a pressure washer. They hold an amazing amount of dirt, and when you're working it, trying to put it back up, you end up with so much sand in your eyes, in your ears, in your mouth, and it's pretty nasty. So just hit them with a pressure washer. That works pretty well. I haven't cleaned these ones yet, so I may get a little dirty in the process of this video. All right, so the first step is cutting it off your fenders. Now the fenders and the bumper are all bolted together and are removed, and I'm talking about the factory Beetle fender bumper combo. They're bolted together, so you need to take them off as one piece. And I find that it's easiest to go ahead and cut that even before I take it off the car. So I'm gonna stop the video, we're gonna walk over to a car here, and I'll show you kind of what it looks like when it's cut. So you can see here, this seam right here and those two bolts, you really can't get to those bolts while this is on the car. The lighter plastic here, that's fender, and this is actually a piece of the bumper. But it's easier to leave it bolted together and go ahead and make this cut while it's on the car. So let me go take you over and show you on a car. So here's a car that we've cut the edges of the fender and bumper off, and here's the great reference that I use. All right, that rear marker light, if you just give it a finger width off that marker light and use that same distance all the way around, you can use the peak that's on the fender, and it's about 1.5 inches, and you just cut all the way up and around. And I find it best to leave the hole so you can see where I've cut in here almost even with that rocker sill. All right, that's where I like to cut them. So let's go back into the garage and we'll look at the one that I've got cut off and it's about ready to go in the car. You can see that's the original ridge, right? And I use 1.5 inches basically as my guideline. From that ridge is where I make my cut. What I like to use for making the cut is the body saw. This guy's really easy to do it with, but if you don't have one of these, you can do it with a lot of different tools. You could use a jigsaw, you could use a cutoff wheel. There's all kinds of stuff you can use to do it. Some of it you may even be able to get with a handsaw or with a sharp enough blade. One thing to be aware of, the bumper material is different than the fender material. So this darker plastic, that's bumper material, and this white plastic is from the fender. They cut different, they sand different, so be aware of that, particularly as you make this transition from one to the other. The black stuff melts very quickly, so especially if you're using a pneumatic sander, it's easier if you go a little bit lower RPM, because this stuff just tends to melt and then ball up on you. Whereas the plastic is pretty, the white plastic is pretty easy to shave and cut too. It does the same thing while you're cutting. Sometimes as you're cutting, it melts right back. So, on to how I chose where to do my cuts. First off, I keep the one hole that's closest to the wheel on that leading edge, because that's going to help me place it so that all these tabs will line up where they need to be when I go to put the wheel liner in. If you're off a little bit, you have to punch new holes in the wheel liner. It's a whole lot easier if everything lines up with the factory holes, and that's how you put the wheel liner back in. So I use this hole as my reference, and that's really what this whole process is about, is getting this placed correctly. Gluing it in is no big deal, but you want it glued in at the right place. Okay, I already mentioned the 1.5 inches that I use from this, and that's simply to give me more surface area. So as I glue it up in there, it's got plenty of surface area. Now you can use 100 different adhesives for this. I like to use the panel bond. It's expensive stuff, but it's really good. And if you goof up a little bit, there's plenty of adhesion there that it's not gonna go anywhere. And it's not something I wanna have to redo later on. So I use panel bond. There's a million other adhesives you could use. You are gluing plastic to fiberglass, so you could use Cabasil. That would work probably very well. And it has nice body to it, so you'll get good coverage and it'll make up for the cracks and variations, and if it bows up a little bit. So Cabosil may be a good option too, but the panel bond is so easy to work with. You squirt it on, shove it in there, put a couple clamps on it, and then let it cure, and you're pretty much done. So I like to leave this bolted. It just makes it a whole lot easier cutting it and working with it, and then you're not worried about that joint not lining up later on. So I recommend leaving that, and that's one reason I like to cut it while it's still on the car. One caution, particularly on the passenger side, as you're cutting, you have to be careful of the emissions control, the carbon canister, and all the lines here. One thing I like about that body saw is it's a very short blade, and it's easy to run it at an angle to even shorten it. So as you're cutting, you're not cutting into that carbon canister or any of the lines in here, because that crap is expensive and hard to troubleshoot if it's not working right. It gives you a CEL, and then you're trying to figure out why you have a CEL. Anyway, so let's say you got them cut. Okay, got them off, then I scuff them up real good, and I like to cut the inner lip off. So as you cut it off the car, it has this nice rounded edge, right, to make that fender look nice. But when you glue that up in here, it can make a double edge that then you're trying to body work to make it look good, right? So with that piece in here, it's hard to show on the video, but you can see that second lip, and that just creates more stuff to have to figure out later. So what I like to do is I just take the saw at an angle, and I cut this basically flat with that surface. So I'm using my saw, and I'm just cutting this way, and I just cut that lip off. So here's what it looks like with that lip cut off. It's a little bit tricky, but it sure is a lot less body work and a lot less visual issues to deal with later on. When you get this guy placed, now it'll all be hidden and you won't see any of that from outside the car. The wheel liner should cover most of it, but you can imagine if you have a little double lip showing here, that then you got to either body fill it, and you're filling between fiberglass and plastic and trying to sand it. And one other thing that I would recommend doing, if you have some body work to do on this lip, do that body work before you glue these in. So we've got it cut off the car, the lip cut off. I've scuffed it real well, so I'm almost ready to glue it in. But what I recommend we do is trial fit it a couple of times. Before you have it covered in glue and you're trying to fit it in there, practice. Just run it a couple of times. Make sure you have footing. My personal technique, and by the way, the passenger side is harder than the driver's side simply because of the carbon canister and all that equipment there. I've put the little clip back in, but I don't have the bolt going through the fiberglass quarter back into this anchor down here in the front, because I'm going to use that hole as my guideline for where this needs to be to line up with all the factory holes in the wheel liner. So I find the best technique for me is to feed it from into the back first, and you can, if I'm pretending that it's covered in glue right now, you can kind of hold it off, run it up there, and then line up those holes in the front. If I was actually gluing it in, I'd go ahead and put a bolt in, and it's naturally kind of laying off here. Having a second person give you a hand is huge right at this point. So you can run a bolt in, and that will keep your spacing correct. Then it's just a matter of setting it down and putting some clamps on it. Make sure you're not putting the clamps across this ridge. Don't try to clamp right on that ridge, because if you start folding that over, these tabs will break off. So you either want to clamp on this surface or this surface. And depending on what kinds of clamps you have, these ones that I'm using here, it doesn't fit in there all that well. So I'm trying to clamp on that surface. An alternative technique particularly if you're working by yourself and don't have someone else to give you a hand, is go ahead and dry fit it. Make sure your clamps are all adjusted. Put that front bolt in, and then lift the back out. And now that kind of holds it for you so you won't get too far out of place. You can hold this back. You can shoot your adhesive on the surface that you need. Set your adhesive gun down. And now you can work up and in there, holding it off the fender. And now the same technique as we were doing in the other technique, working front to back from that reference. And clamping as we kind of mush it along. Same process, working all the way back. It's not super critical if you get some adhesive smeared around in there, it's no big deal. But you do want to have, it's just like with anything else you use adhesive on, you want kind of a bead so that as you mush those two pieces together, that it oozes out and gets you a large surface area. That's the whole idea of cutting this a little bit wider, is that we have lots of surface area for that adhesion. The panel bond is, I believe it's 3,900 PSI, so every square inch of good adhesion gives you 3,900 pounds of shear strength. So you get a couple inches in there, you're gonna be okay. If you're putting more stress than that on your wheel liner, something else is going wrong. But we still wanna try to do it right. So I'm gonna go with this technique, the second technique. So let me get my gloves on and the adhesive out, and we're gonna go ahead and put this guy in. I like to take the label off of my adhesive tube so that I can see how much is left. You can see there I got, I don't know, maybe a third left in there. I wanna make sure I only use half of this so that I got enough left to do the other side. So just a little technique that I've found with these tubes. Another point, you can mix this without the mixing tube. You just don't, if you used all your tubes and they're all hardened, you can just squeeze it out, and the virtue of the gun, it will give you the correct ratio. Squeeze it out on the mixing board and mix it up, and you can spread it with a putty knife or stir stick or whatever you got. Anyway, let's get this glued on. I did forget to mention that I wiped everything down with acetone before I put the adhesive on. So I'm all ready to go. Now all I gotta do is let that cure for about 24 hours, and I can take the clamps off, and that thing's in there. It isn't going anywhere. Now, when I go to put the wheel liner in, I find that I am off a little bit. Some of the holes are slotted, so you can work it a little bit, but if I'm too far off to make the slot work, I can just punch a new hole in the wheel liner. But hopefully I won't need to, because it makes life a whole lot easier. If you have another technique that works well, or a different idea, go ahead and put it in the comments, as well as a question or another suggestion. By all means, the whole idea here is to share ideas with each other, and we all just keep getting better and better at making these things. Like and subscribe so I can use that support to keep building more stuff and bringing you more videos. Thanks for watching.